Thanks a million, everyone, for joining. I am the CEO and co-founder of Hexus, and I'm delighted to welcome you here to this special on fueling Grand Tours with Professor James Morton, Dr. Sam Impey, and of course, Bob Jungels, who has kindly jumped off the massage table over at the tour to give up some of his time on his rest day and share his insights, not just from this tour, but from the wealth of experience he has from the pro peloton throughout his career. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our first speaker and our keynote speaker today, Professor James Morton, who has, without a doubt, been, I would say, the most influential sports nutritionist in the last decade. I think, James, your research and then the application and translation of that research and exercise metabolism into sports and performance nutrition strategies has really changed how athletes across the world fuel before, during, and after exercise to maximize not just how they're performing, but also how they're adapting. So without further ado, I want to hand straight over to James. I'll put myself on mute.
Okay, thank you, David, and thanks for the opportunity to present today. As you briefly mentioned, my background is based in both academic research and applied practice. I've been based in Liverpool John Moores University in the UK for over 20 years, where I've led a research group on exercise metabolism. But like many people on the call today, I've also worked in professional sport. I started off working in team sports with Liverpool Football Club between 2010 and 2015. And then I transferred over to endurance sports, where I had an incredible time working with Team Sky between the time of 2015 to 2019. And I actually learned so much, not just about metabolism and performance, but also about what makes a great sports team. And a lot of that I'll share in today's call. I then left Team Sky in 2019 and I started working in industry with science and sports. So I'm sure many people on the call will actually use some of science and sports products. And so I lead a research and innovation program to support those products. And then most recently, I've also been working for Ineos Sport, who, as you probably know, they own, part own, or partner with some of the world's biggest sports teams. And unfortunately, as a Liverpool supporter, they recently purchased Manchester United. So the last few months hasn't been particularly enjoyable for myself. Now, as I return to today's call, there's three things that I'd like to share. First of all, to outline a review of carbohydrate availability and exercise performance. Secondly, to then get into the concept of carbohydrate periodization, or in effect, carbohydrate restriction, to deliberately try and promote training adaptation. And those first two sections really provide the basis for fueling Grand Tours. And so very much today's talk is very much science to practice or knowledge to delivery, which is the terms that I often use. Now I'm going to start today's talk with a seminal paper that was published back in the late 1960s. And when you reflect back on the sport nutrition industry and the landscape of sport nutrition, I guess you could say that the period from 1960 to the 1980s was kind of the muscle glycogen era. And in this seminal paper, this was the first time that researchers had actually measured muscle glycogen, how it responds to high carbohydrate diets, and how it actually affects exercise performance. And so what you see in the following slide, on the x-axis is muscle glycogen concentration. On the y-axis is exercise capacity at 75% VO2 max. And participants were asked to exercise until the point of exhaustion. Each circle in this data point actually represents an individual subject. And each subject performed the exercise capacity test in conditions of high carbohydrate availability, which was 8 grams per kilogram body mass, their normal diet, or actually 3 days of a high fat diet and a high protein diet. And in effect, what you see is that consuming high carbohydrate intake for several days increases muscle glycogen stores and then improves the exercise capacity. And when you look at the exercise capacity data, you can see that carbohydrate is making people ride for longer to the extent of 2 to 3 hours longer. And so I'm pretty sure that all of us on today's call would like to have those performance benefits. And we can achieve that through something as simple as ensuring sufficient carbohydrate availability. I'm going to skip 50 years of research actually and jump to the most recent sport nutrition guidelines, which were published back in 2016. Now, when you look at those guidelines, you can see daily carbohydrate recommendations ranging from 3 grams per kilogram body mass up until 12 grams per kilogram. And you can also see the acute fueling strategies, which generally recommend that in order to fuel up our carbohydrate load, then a range of 7 to 12 grams per kilogram. Now, those guidelines were published, as I mentioned, back in 2016, and I think it's fair to say that probably they're a little bit outdated, and actually we should probably challenge those guidelines. And I think we should also interpret them with a little bit of nuances. And it's great to have Bob on today's call because I'm sure he will share his experiences of eating considerably more than 12 grams per kilogram. And certainly in my experiences of working with elite endurance athletes, I've seen that they consume a range between 3 and 20 grams per kilogram per day, especially during competitive events such as the cycling Grand Tours. In other words, the Tour de France, the Vuelta a España, or the Giro d'Italia. I think it's also interpret those guidelines with a little bit of nuances because rather than specifically discussing the absolute daily carbohydrate intake, I think it's more important to consider the magnitude and the time course of post-exercise carbohydrate feeding in order to optimally prepare for the next training session or the next race day. So Bob, who's over in the Tour de France at the minute, is already preparing for tomorrow's stage. And so actually the most important question is not specifically how much he will eat across the entire 24-hour period, but rather how much he will eat this evening and tomorrow morning in order to prepare for the upcoming stage. Now, I just want to illustrate that by referring back to some data from our laboratory several years ago. So again, the question from a practical perspective, how much carbohydrate and how much glycogen do we need for the upcoming desired workload? So this was part of Mark Harris's PhD project, and he actually performed a study where on the evening of day one, participants performed a glycogen depleting exercise protocol. So high intensity exercise for around 2 hours to completely deplete glycogen stores. They then performed one of 3 dietary feeding protocols in the overnight period. Low carbohydrate, which was just whey protein only, a moderate carbohydrate intake or a high carbohydrate intake. But when you look at the calculations there, you can see that the high carbohydrate intake equates to just over 7 grams per kilogram. So at the lower end of that recommended fueling up recommendations that you've seen in the guidelines. On the morning of day 2, we brought them back to the lab and we asked them to perform 8 3-minute intervals at 80% peak power output, followed by 1-minute intervals until the point of exhaustion. And we actually did the low carbohydrate trial first, and we took a biopsy at the point of fatigue. And then we then randomized the moderate and the high carbohydrate trial. We also took a time-matched biopsy at the point of fatigue. And then we also took a biopsy finally post-exercise when they actually did fatigue in those trials. So what you see here, first of all, is muscle glycogen concentration before exercise in the morning of day 2, which is the pre-bars in the low, moderate, and high. And then you can also see glycogen concentration at the point of fatigue or the time-matched biopsy in those 3 trials. Now, what I'd like to draw your attention to is that actually when you look at glycogen concentration in terms of what we would say is high, medium, or low, even in this study, when consuming 7.6 grams per kilogram in the overnight period, none of those subjects got into the high glycogen range. In fact, they just about touched the medium glycogen range. And so therefore, those sport nutrition recommendations of advising at least 7 to 12 grams to fuel up in a 24-hour period, in many cases may not be enough, depending on the exercise that is required for the next day. And again, in Mark's study, when we actually measured exercise capacity, you can see that even in the high carbohydrate trial, these participants could only manage around 70 minutes of exercise, albeit high intensity exercise. But of course, in the context of the elite endurance athlete, 70 minutes is pretty much not touching the sides for the types of training sessions and competitions that these males and female athletes complete. I would say that the next 2 decades in the carbohydrate story was probably the sports drink era. And so the 1980s and 1990s saw lots of research looking at sports drink studies. But when you look back at some of those research studies, the problem is the lab studies typically don't adopt real world feeding protocols where multiple carbohydrate formats are consumed, in other words, solids, fluids, and gels. So we published a paper a few years ago in the Journal of Physiology, trying to replicate almost a typical stage type feeding protocol. So again, this was part of Mark Feld's PhD thesis. Subjects performed glycogen depletion on day 1. They then consumed a high carbohydrate diet in order to load up for exercise in day 3. And then during day 3, they performed 3 hours of exercise just below their lactate threshold. They then performed an exercise capacity test at 150% of the lactate threshold. We were actually trying to simulate a bit of an attack on a climb. In other words, how long can you hold a given power output for? And in this study, the subjects did it in conditions of 0 grams per hour, 45 grams per hour, or 90 grams per hour, using a mix and match approach of solids, liquids, and gels. And when you feed carbohydrate during exercise, of course, what you get is you try and maintain blood glucose concentrations. So here you can see over the first 3 hours of exercise, the glucose concentrations begins to decline when we feed water only, whereas when we consume carbohydrate during exercise, then we can maintain glucose concentrations around baseline levels, which is around 5 millimoles per liter. Now what you see on the left-hand side is whole body rates of carbohydrate oxidation. So this is how many grams of carbohydrate that we are burning per hour during exercise. And despite the fact that we feed carbohydrate during exercise, you can see that whole body rates of carbohydrate oxidation actually decline. In other words, the body is running out of carbohydrate and we're then starting to use more fat as a fuel. But when we feed carbohydrate during exercise, we can offset the decline in carbohydrate use that you typically see. But even when feeding 45 and 90 grams per hour, we still get that decline in whole body rates of carbohydrate use. Now, on the right-hand side, you can see the exercise capacity data. So this was after the 3 hours of exercise. We asked them to exercise at 150% of their threshold to the point of exhaustion. And you can see that we've seen exercise capacity improved in a dose-dependent manner. So with the 90 grams per hour trial, around 100 seconds longer than the 45 grams and the 0 grams per hour. And of course, this has real physiological meaning because you can put this into context by watching a bike race and seeing what 100 seconds actually translates to in terms of distance covered on a climb. And that really can be the difference between winning and losing. And certainly in my own experiences of working with Grand Tour riders, I've seen riders lose races because of underfueling on a day. You may not win the Tour de France on a single stage, but you can certainly lose the Tour de France on a single stage. And quite often underfueling is one of the main reasons contributing to that underperformance. What we also seen during that study is something called the crossover effect. So here you can see the rate of energy production or energy utilization from carbohydrate and from fat during 3 hours. And what you get is this little crossover point. So when carbohydrate availability becomes limiting, then you get a crossover point such that the amount of fat that you use actually becomes the predominant substrate. So you can see that in the red bars. Now, when you actually consume 45 grams per hour of carbohydrate during exercise, then you're delaying the crossover point. You can delay it by around 30 minutes or so. But when you feed 90 grams per hour, you can delay that crossover point even further. In this case, it occurs at around 160 minutes per hour. And so actually consuming that carbohydrate during exercise really does have physiological effects because it delays the point at which carbohydrate availability becomes limiting. I'd like you to remember those numbers, that in conditions of water only, it occurs around 2 hours of exercise. When consuming 90 grams per hour, at least in these participants, it was around 160 minutes of exercise. If I return to the sport nutrition guidelines and we now look at carbohydrate feeding, typically you see that the recommendations are up to 90 grams per hour, and usually that's from dual source blends such as glucose, maltodextrin, and fructose. However, we should also put those guidelines into a bit of context because even if someone ingests 90 grams per hour, it doesn't actually mean that they will be burning 1.5 grams per minute. And so actually, if you wanted to really oxidize 1.5 grams per minute or 90 grams per hour, then you should probably ingest closer to 120 grams per hour. And certainly that is a trend that I do see amongst elite riders at the minute. And I think a lot of that trend is supported with real sound evidence. And this is one of our studies that we published a couple of years ago, actually. And this was an interesting study because we fed 120 grams per hour, but we also did it in conditions of a drink only, a gel only, a jelly chew, or more often than not, which is the practices of elite riders, a mix and match approach where they consumed one portion of each in order to hit that 120 grams per hour. So this was part of Mark Harris's postdoctoral work, and similar to the previous designs, we did the same 3 hours exercise just below threshold, followed by that exercise capacity test. We did it in conditions of carbohydrate loading for the 36-hour period. And then, as I mentioned, we then did it in conditions of feeding 120 grams per hour in a mix and match jelly, gel, drink, or a water-only trial. Now here you can see whole body rates of carbohydrate oxidation. And the 2 points to note is of course, with water only, you get a real reduction in whole body use because carbohydrate availability is limiting. But when you feed that 120 grams per hour, you get a better maintenance of rates of carbohydrate use. And actually, in using the products that we used in that trial, it didn't matter which format you used. So they're all being effectively digested, absorbed, and burned at the same rate, regardless of whether the participant used one form over another. On the right-hand side, you can now see the rates of carbohydrate use from the products that were being ingested. And like I mentioned when we referred back to the sport nutrition guidelines, here you can see after 180 minutes of exercise, participants are indeed oxidizing over 1.5 grams per minute. In some individual cases, we were getting as close to 1.8 and 1.9 grams per minute. And these are some of the highest rates of exogenous carbohydrate oxidation ever reported in the literature. Now, when we look at the crossover point, this was the water-only trial, similar to the previous study. Again, it occurs just over 2 hours of exercise. But when you feed 120 grams of carbohydrates per hour, in this context, we didn't even see a crossover point. And so I often see people writing reports and blogs and so on saying that 120 grams is no better than 90. But certainly in my experiences and in the findings from these studies, you can see that that additional 30 grams per hour, which in this case was 90 grams in total, actually did have real physiological benefits because it completely delayed or prevented the crossover point. We've seen some of the highest rates of carbohydrate use ever reported in the literature. So much so that in the 3rd hour of exercise, when you look at the contribution of the different energy sources, in the green bars, the exogenous carbohydrate that you're consuming during exercise is now accounting for over 50% of total energy production. So I think there is a real rationale to consume those high carbohydrate intakes if the desired intensity and duration actually requires it. Some of you on the call may be familiar with a podcast that I hosted several years ago during COVID, actually, by Science and Sport. It's available on Apple and Spotify. But one of the episodes was with Theo Gegenhardt. And Theo actually comments on some of the high carbohydrate intakes that he's consumed during his experiences as a Grand Tour rider.
It's a very fine line between fatigue being as a result of training or as a result of being underfueled. And of course, that's a balance that we're always trying to toe in a sport where your weight is still so important. But I think every year I've become more and more aware of how well I can fuel and looking back at some of the big days in my career, and you think, wow, it's incredible how much I ate that day.
So if I was to summarize part 1 of today's session, I'd summarize it as follows. And hopefully I've tried to convince you that there is a real rationale for high carbohydrate intakes, certainly on race day. There's a high rationale for carbohydrate feeding during exercise to prevent a limitation in carbohydrate availability. So at least for optimal race day performance, then I think the principles of high carbohydrate availability before, during, and after exercise should really apply to a lot of elite endurance athletes, certainly Grand Tour cyclists, which is the focus of today's session. I'm now going to switch attention to part 2 of the talk and to do the complete opposite, actually, which is to talk about the training scenario rather than the race day scenario. And so actually, when you look at the last 2 decades of sport nutrition research, you could probably classify that as the molecular biology era. And so a lot of researchers around the world have been trying to uncover the molecular mechanisms by which muscle adapts to exercise training. And what we now know is that what we eat before, during, and after every single training session has the capacity to significantly change how muscle adapts to exercise training. Now, this paper was published back in 2005. It was published from a very famous research group in Denmark. And it's fair to say that this paper had a real profound influence on my own career. It was the first time that I actually ever came across the language of train low, compete high. Now, this study used a very famous exercise model from Copenhagen called the one-legged knee extensor model, where effectively you're isolating the quadriceps muscle group and you perform a kicking exercise motion with one limb only. And so these researchers over a 10-week period actually performed one limb twice per day, which you can see representative on the schematic here with the low trial, and each white dot represents an exercise session. So here they performed 2 sessions on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Thursday, and the pattern completed itself for 10 weeks. But every afternoon training session was deliberately completed with low muscle glycogen concentrations. The contralateral limb was called the normal limb. This limb performed exactly the same amount of work over the 10-week period, but this limb only performed a training session once every consecutive day. And so that limb then commenced each training session with high glycogen concentration or normal glycogen concentration. So in effect, the low limb is doing the opposite of conventional sport nutrition guidelines because it's deliberately commencing each training session with low muscle glycogen concentrations. Now, these researchers actually took muscle biopsies and they measured many adaptations, but on the top right, you can see citrate synthase activity, which is one of the main aerobic enzymes in our muscles. And from pre-training to post-training, they've seen greater changes in the limb that trained with low glycogen. In the bottom right hand, they actually got both limbs to perform an exercise capacity test. And the low glycogen limb, after that 10 weeks of training, could effectively exercise for twice as long. So the practical application and the message from this paper was this train low, compete high, that actually if you want to maximize training adaptations, then perhaps it's a good thing to deliberately commence some of your training, not all of your training, but some of your training with low muscle glycogen, but then always commence competition with high glycogen stores. The limitation, of course, of that study is it was a one-legged knee extensor model. So several years later, in Liverpool, we performed another research trial. This time we had 3 groups and we were looking at high intensity interval running. We had one group that we trained once per day, and we call that a normal group. We also had a low group who did the twice per day model, and every second afternoon session was with low carbohydrate. But then we also introduced a third group, and that third group we called low plus glucose, because yes, they also did the twice per day sessions. But in that second afternoon session, they also consumed carbohydrate. So that group actually did commence that session with low muscle glycogen, but you could say that they had still sufficient carbohydrate availability because they also consumed carbohydrate during exercise. Because it was running exercise, we took biopsies from the gastrocnemius muscles. We measured many adaptations. Here's another marker of aerobic enzyme activity. And from pre-training to post-training, we also seen the greatest change in that twice per day low plus placebo group. So commencing with low muscle glycogen did seem to be having an enhanced effect. But actually, if you look at the red bars, the low plus glucose bars, when you consumed carbohydrate during the second session, despite the fact that it had low pre-exercise glycogen, we actually reduced the very adaptations that we were trying to achieve in the first place. Now, I guess in the 15 years since, many researchers around the world have looked at different forms of carbohydrate restriction. It could be that twice per day model that I've just shown you. It could be no sports drinks. It could be commencing training fasted or with protein only and having carbohydrate after training rather than before. It could be deliberately recovering from training with low carbohydrate intake. It could be even performing a late night session to sleep with low muscle glycogen and then to train low the next morning. Regardless of the model that you use, there's very strong evidence actually that if you restrict carbohydrate enough over a prolonged period, you will get an enhanced training adaptation, at least in terms of aerobic adaptations. The interesting thing is when you speak and you work with some of the world's best endurance athletes, whether it's runners or cyclists or even triathletes, a lot of them are doing this almost by default, almost subconsciously, and they've got many decades of training history with an accumulated experience of training in a carbohydrate deficit. And my own belief is that that's probably one of the main signals that has caused these individuals to become so elite in the first place. The challenge for practitioners is to not do this all of the time, because of course, if you do, then you run into problems and performance will eventually suffer. What are the molecular mechanisms that we're trying to uncover? Why this actually works? Well, this is a very simple schematic actually, but maybe not for many on the call. But what we actually do know is that when you commence session in conditions of low carbohydrate or high fat availability, or indeed calorie restriction, then you effectively get an enhanced activation of many of the molecular pathways that regulate training adaptations. And much of the research is actually centered on a signaling pathway called the AMPK PGC1 alpha pathway. And these are effectively two little switches that are present in our muscles. And every time we train and we exercise, we're trying to basically switch these little proteins on. And when you do, it effectively instructs our DNA to make our muscles more aerobic-like. And we've tried to actually summarize that practically using the principle of fueling for the work required. This was some of Sam's PhD studies. Actually, and what we did in Sam's study was we performed an exercise capacity test in conditions of high or low carbohydrate availability over a 36-hour period. People commenced exercise with what I would say is high glycogen concentration, so in excess of 600 millimoles. They could then exercise for almost 90 minutes longer than those individuals who commenced it with low glycogen concentration. So here you can see the high, medium, and low. And when we actually measured the activation of some of those little signaling pathways, in this case AMPK, you can see that you switch it on faster. So even though people are fatiguing quicker, you're actually switching a lot of this molecular machinery on faster. And so the take-home message is that if your exercise session tomorrow, or 48 hours or 72 hours time, if it doesn't require long exercise, if it's not particularly hard exercise, then you fuel for the work required. And maybe it's about restricting carbohydrate intake. If it's a longer session, a much harder session, and you need to perform at your best, then of course you commence it with high carbohydrate intake. I'm just going to wrap up this second section, but actually, is it about training low or finish low? And actually, I think a lot of the research would suggest that it isn't really about how you start exercise, it's about how you finish that counts. And what we mean by that is that when you look through a lot of the research, and depending on what they measure, in the red bars is actually the range of glycogen concentrations for people who have started and commenced exercise with low glycogen versus commencing and finishing with high glycogen in the green bars. And you tend to see a lot of these enhanced adaptations when actually individuals only deplete glycogen to around 250 millimoles per less. If you commence exercise with higher glycogen, it will just take you longer to get into that glycogen threshold hypothesis that we postulated several years ago. People always ask me, does carbohydrate periodization actually improve performance? I believe that it does in the elite athlete, definitely. But I do want to direct your attention to this research paper that, again, we published during COVID. This was using a sleep low, train low design. It's freely available online to download, so please read that in your own time. But basically what we've seen is the carbohydrate periodization using the sleep low, train low model with, I guess, the same standard of athlete, perhaps, that's on the call today. So this is like real people who train a lot, not truly elite, but real amateur cyclists. And we've seen it over a 3 or 4 week period. This was a remote training study. So everyone uploaded all of their training files using software like Training Peaks. And we went through all of the data. And what we've seen was that the sleep low, train low model significantly improved functional threshold power when compared to a consistently high carbohydrate intake. So to summarize part 2 of the talk, I think, well, look, in my experience and my interpretation of the research and my practical experience, I think there is accumulating evidence to suggest that carbohydrate periodization, I use the term periodization rather than restriction. I think if you carefully periodize, you can get enhanced training responses. We've communicated that using a fuel for the work required approach. And when you look at the models, actually, I think the sleep low, train low model is probably the best because it gives you that longest time period where you're in that deliberately glycogen threshold, if you like. Now, finally, I'd like to close by trying to put this into practice. So as I've mentioned, we communicate this with athletes using fueling for the work required, but effectively what we mean is a meal by meal and a day by day approach to carbohydrate intake. And that was basically how we practiced our nutritional strategy at Team Sky. This is a direct quote from Chris Froome. Chris used to like putting pictures on social media, quite often of low carb days. And then many people would interpret that he was racing like that or training like that as well. But of course he wasn't, because it was a carbohydrate periodization model. And Chris came out and was quite vocal actually to say that he believed in high carb, medium carb, and low carb, and not extremes. We used to communicate that to our riders with our in-house app. And so what you see here is a 4-day training block, 4 different types of rides, and a traffic light system underneath each ride with 4 feeding points, which was breakfast, on-bike fueling, post-bike fueling, and then the evening meal. And each one of those colors represents low carbohydrate in red, medium carbohydrate in amber, and high carbohydrate in green. And so every rider would fuel for the work required in a 3 or 4 day cycle using this traffic light system, where each color they receive bespoke individualized carbohydrate recommendations. And that's great because it's a super simple behavioral change approach for an athlete to follow, which really forms the basis of the next talk and how Hexus is trying to communicate that message that every athlete is unique. And of course, the technologies now went to a different level, and you can see real individualized bespoke recommendations, meal by meal, day by day, dependent upon your training goals and what your training looks like. When I come back to fueling for an actual Grand Tour, then of course you work back from the demands of the event, and every rider should have their own individual performance plan. I've just used this as an example. This was one of my favorite Grand Tours actually, when Geraint Thomas won the Tour de France. But again, the tour route comes out about 6 months before, and you can work back and you can predict the demands of each stage. You can decide as a practitioner and as an athlete, what are the key stages that you really need to be well fueled for? What are the key stages when perhaps you don't need to fuel so well? And then how can you periodize your carbohydrate intake in race? Actually, because not every day really requires high carbohydrate availability, though I am conscious that races are being raced at a different intensity to what they were several years ago. But lo and behold, it's usually flat type stages, which quite often are lower intensity and perhaps not as carbohydrate dependent as the mountain stages, where usually the race is won or lost. You can, of course, have the time trial stages, which are highly carbohydrate dependent in terms of fuel use. But in terms of the absolute amount of carbohydrate required, not as much, because of course the duration is less. But you should also consider environmental conditions. Without doubt, heat stress significantly increases carbohydrate use. Now, Grand Tours like the Tour de France don't necessarily have conditions like this, but the earlier stage races do in the season. Sometimes the Giro d'Italia can have real cold days that can really accelerate carbohydrate use, as can racing in the crosswinds in these types of conditions. It's also important to consider what happens when a rider gets injured, because it's very easy to put on weight over the course of several days if they have had a bad crash. And so you then may be deliberately reducing carbohydrate intake if you're trying to maintain absolute body mass, which isn't always a good idea, but certainly it does happen. But from a practical perspective, it's really about fueling on the road. And I think actually when I look back on my time working in Grand Tour cycling, Team Sky was probably one of the first teams to really take this serious, I think, with a real level of individualized and detailed approach. It's now commonplace for many teams to have their own mobile kitchen truck. I think Team Sky was probably one of the first. We also had 3 performance chefs, and I'm sure we'll hear later on from Sam that the relationship between the practitioner, in other words, the nutritionist, the chef, and the rider is so important in terms of fueling for the work required. The kitchen truck environment is great, of course, because you can actually control the environment that you want to create. You can really have individualized fueling plans put in place. But from a practitioner's perspective, that's really where you do your amount of coaching. In fact, if you look carefully here, you can see portion guide sizes on the wall, but here at the back. But actually, infographics and so on don't always change behavior. And that's really where you need a practitioner to get involved in nutrition coaching and coach the rider on how to make the correct choices at the right times. In my experiences as a practitioner, we actually we recorded everything we served for 5 years. So I've got all sorts of food logs from everything that was served on every single stage, every single day. All of our meals were customized. We have food labels behind every meal, trying to coach and educate each rider. And of course, this is all now commonplace amongst many teams at the elite level. In terms of absolute macronutrient intakes, I would say that most elite riders are probably somewhere between 5 and 20 grams per kilogram per day of carbohydrate, depending on the stage. Protein and fat intake is usually constant, around 3 and 2, respectively. I think it is, of course, really important to work with a good supplement provider because, of course, trying to consume all of that carbohydrate intake from food is very, very difficult. We were very lucky to work with Science and Sport and make bespoke formulations, whether it was gels, chews, drinks, or whatever. And that was really important in helping to hit those daily carbohydrate intakes. Fueling on the road ranged from as little as 30 grams to as much as 120 grams of carbohydrates per hour. Racing probably is being raced at a higher intensity now, so I think most riders are probably erring towards in excess of 90, especially on those big days consistently. And then finally, I just want to close by sharing a case study from my own practice, which again was also one of my favorite races. This was the 2018 Giro d'Italia. Many of you on the call will remember this race actually, because this is the race where Chris Froome pulled back 3 minutes 22 seconds on stage 19, which is probably one of the most famous stages now in the history of the sport. But we got to that stage in the team where we were weighing out every single meal. In fact, riders were doing it themselves. They were very comfortable. They knew the guidelines. They knew how to tailor it for themselves. And this is Chris's daily carbohydrate intake over the last 10 days of that particular race, from stage 11 through to stage 19. We knew that stage 17, 18, and 19 was going to be the biggest block in terms of energy expenditure. And on the top of the slide now, you can see the absolute workload on the bike. So stage 19 was over 6,000 kilojoules per day stage. In the early stages of the race, we were actually trying to maintain and, in fact, reduce absolute body mass in order to get ready for the mountains and fuel really well. So it was a periodized approach, similar to what we did in training, but actually we were doing it in racing. But make no mistake about it, stage 18 and 19 were super hard days and super high carbohydrate intakes, especially to get ready and prepare for stage 19. Chris, of course, did go out and fuel really well on stage 19. We actually switched much of our fueling source from solids and gels to fluids because it was easier to get that carbohydrate intake. He was consuming well over 100 grams of carbohydrates per hour, one of the biggest, highest fueling days that he's ever had in his career. And straight after the stage, both Chris and our team principal acknowledged the role of fueling in promoting that performance.
Today was about fueling, and today was about making sure that you can fuel a ride like this all the way through to the end, and that is fundamental. And so all the members of staff, every single one of them, myself included, have been outside the road and put in place a fueling plan for him to make sure that he would absolutely not miss a beat, because that's basically the game changer.
Okay, so I'd just like to close by leaving you with a take-home message. And this is based on both academic research and practical experience, but I think really it's about understanding the demands of the event, understanding what actually determines performance in the first place. But from a sport nutrition perspective, fueling for the work required seems to be a simple, practical message that people understand. And I've had a lot of success as a coach using that traffic light system in a meal by meal, day by day approach. And whilst I'm actually promoting and advocating elements of carbohydrate restriction in training to promote carbohydrate periodization, on race day, carbohydrate remains king. But really, it's about trying to develop a rider who's ready to race based on what they've done in training, but who can then turn up on race day and who's ready to race to win. So on that note, thank you very much for listening.
James, thanks a million for that. I'm sure I can speak on behalf of the hundreds of people listening to say that was phenomenal. And not just thank you for that, but thank you also to yourself and the Liverpool John Moores Lab for the contributions to the research and its translation into applied practice over the last 2 decades. I think it's great to see how it's moved, as you said right at the start, from paper to podium. I think that's a really, really important message to deliver. There's been some really good questions that have come through that we really want to answer, conscious of time. So for everyone that has submitted a question, we will answer it at the end. And if we don't have time at the end, we'll get back to them all on our social channels after this. But I'd like to hand over now to Dr. Sam Impey, who you've already seen a highlight of some of his research from James's slides. and I will leave him to it.
Lovely. Thanks, thanks, David. I will say as well, for anybody that's got questions for Bob as well, please drop them into the chat. So I'm just going to do a quick 5 minutes, and then we'll jump into the Q&A with Bob. So yeah, so I'm Dr. Sam Impey. I'm one of the co-founders of Hexus, and I really just wanted to essentially share kind of my journey after James showed the embarrassing older photo of me with much more hair than I've got now. Yeah, I actually went to work in the World Tour myself, so I actually ended up doing 9 Grand Tours and 3 Tour de France's with the World Tour teams. As James mentioned, though, a lot of my role, and I guess to echo his point, something that was really important was to actually get a collaborative system in place, working with the chefs and the other members of staff on the team to be able to make bespoke nutrition recommendations for each athlete, depending on the work that they've done on that day. It's a very manual process. It takes a lot of calculations because obviously you have 8 very unique athletes riding the stage, and they'll all do different jobs depending on their role within the team. So you could have very different fueling and energy requirements depending on the type of rider that they were, and obviously those change day to day, as James showed, given the length and the meters of elevation within within the stage. And so we kind of really wanted to lean in and think about, well, how do we begin to use the technology that's available? We were recording more data than ever, and we were able to share that very succinctly and very effectively. So how could we do that to effectively make better nutrition recommendations? We published it in this case study where we sort of summarized how we approached it more generally, but we used the context of creating that carbohydrate periodization, as James was talking about, throughout a Grand Tour. And I just wanted to share kind of some of the data with you here, just to sort of really show the magnitude of change that a rider can go through. So the graph on the left, the axis going up, is carbohydrate intake across the day in grams per kilo of body mass. So 11.5 grams per kilo. If you look at day 1, for example, 70-kilo rider, you're at a little over 800 grams of carbohydrate for the day. So you can see there's really big variability day to day, obviously with kind of rest days and some higher level days as well. So the average intake is 13.8 grams per kilo. Okay, well, that's great, but actually if you plot that, you can see that you're only actually meeting fuel requirements for maybe 2, maybe 3 stages, and there's sort of 6 where you're really over fueling, and kind of 12 or 13 where you're really under fueling. So I really hope that shows just how much variability you can have day to day, and why it's important to use all that data that's available to make the bespoke recommendations to enable each athlete to perform optimally. Now, this is in the context of a Grand Tour, but also, these are sort of the recreational, the everyday athlete also experiences this. If you're going out and doing an hour on the bike or an hour on the turbo in training, but actually then 2, 3, 4 hours at the weekend, those energy demands and those carbohydrate demands are going to be so different for each day. And so that's really how we kind of began to think about, well, how do we automate, or how do we give good recommendations, for each individual athlete, whether you're riding a stage of the Tour de France or whether you're training for your first sportif. And I guess I really want to highlight again the magnitude of just how different some of these intakes can be. 5 grams per kilo per day on a rest day, through to the Queen stage in this tour, which was the intake was 18.7 grams per kilo per day. So yeah, pretty massive. And I'm sure Bob will echo the challenge of consuming that kind of amount of carbohydrate. And I guess the thing that we really kind of the key output from our case study was that actually, yeah, when you do look at contemporary guidelines, they talk about averages as James mentioned in that 8 to 12 gram per kilo region. But actually, they really fail to capture the substantial day-by-day variation in carbohydrate intake that's required in the context of a Grand Tour. Yeah, really, obviously, massively elevated and very extreme examples. But actually, in everyone's day-to-day training, we're going to have variability. And creating that periodization is where we're able to drive those adaptations that James was talking about. And that's really kind of the sort of the basis of Hexus. We took the learnings from our applied practice and the research that we'd done, and we wanted to use that day-by-day and meal-by-meal approach with that red, amber, and green systems to help people quickly and easily identify how to create carbohydrate periodization. And you know, really fundamentally, every athlete is unique, and we should all have unique fueling plans. And that also is true for coaches. So how do coaches help to support a large number of athletes, often in different areas of the country or different areas of the world, with good nutrition recommendations at a high resolution? And again, that's something that we were really keen to look to build. And so that's why we built our coaches platform. But it just gives a flavor of how the research that was done originally and the sort of applied combined experience has fed into the, you know, the product that we built. And, you know, that's why we want to help, you know, thousands of people all across the globe to fuel effectively. So as I said, just a very quick summary from me there. I obviously don't want to interrupt Bob's time because I'm also interested to hear how he manages to do it. So with that, I'll pass back over to David.
Sam, thanks a million for that. I think it's great to see the translation now from the research through to the application, and how technology is now helping that scale that service across quite a wide range of individuals. Now, Bob, you're dialing in directly from the tour. I know you're not long off the massage table that's made time here for us today. First of all, how are you feeling on the back of yesterday, and did you have enough capacity mentally for the last hour?
Yeah, I mean, it's 2 weeks into the tour after also 6 weeks of preparation. So yeah, it's beginning to take a toll physically and mentally. But yeah, 1 week to go, and like you said, yesterday was a really big day for myself. Spending all day in the breakaway, trying to win the stage with Jai Hindley, a teammate of mine, and yeah, so really big day, and pretty much enjoying this rest day today, and which was necessary. Yeah.
Brilliant. And Bob, I'm conscious we've seen the absolute polarization of what James and Sam have shown, from 3 grams per kilo all the way up to sort of 20 grams per kilo, and the same in terms of on-bike fueling. So from your experience, I'd love to, and one of the questions we had before this was, given that the research has evolved so rapidly, you know, prior to this work being done, what does it feel like when you got it wrong? Because, you know, when you need 20 grams per kilo and you don't necessarily cook that, where James has highlighted sports nutrition guidelines might have only gone as high as 12 previously. I'd love to know what that experience was like, and then when you realized you needed to change things.
I mean, I think everybody who's been on the bike or running or any kind of sports has experienced, you know, bonking or hitting the wall and just having a massive hunger flare, which is eventually if you don't eat at all or not enough. But I think what's interesting during the last years, the amounts of carbohydrates that we eat during the exercise before and after has increased so much, and I think it just, you know, the capacity or the performance on the bike and the recovery has just improved so much. So it's not like you don't feel like hitting a wall or being completely empty, but it's just you can't reach those super high levels of threshold or VO2 max and over and over again, and even the recovery during the stage and is less good. And if you have a little too less fueling during the day or even before, you know. So yeah, like I said, that has been the biggest difference also for me, coming from, let's say, starting maybe 12, 13 years ago until this day.
Paul is a really good question for you here, Bob, because obviously it's a lot of food, you know, 18 grams per kilo or those sort of high teens. How long does it practically take you to eat that kind of food and also get used to eating that much food?
Well, it actually, we have to practice eating, digesting, and yeah, just consuming that much food. That's why we have let's say the altitude training camps before the races, training over the winter, So we need to train our gut to digest and to absorb this kind of these kind of amounts of food, and I think it's super interesting to see how much more work goes into the whole nutrition part of sports nowadays, and it's definitely been the biggest change over the last years in our sport. So but yeah, it takes a lot of practice, and that's what we do in our training camps. So it's not only on bike training, but also like I said, training the gut and digestion.
Completely. And I think, Brandon had a question, which, James, this one might be more relevant to you, but on that note of training the gut, Bob, Brandon's asked, the idea that some people have 120 grams per hour of carbohydrate delivery, maybe being no better than 90 grams per hour, is that now coming from a lack of evidence that was in the literature pre-2002, do you think, James? Suggesting that 120 grams now is better? Or do you think it's actually people's hesitance prior to that on pushing the boundary?
Well, there's a few things to unpick there, actually, but great question. So there was a number of studies in the 90s and even before then showing that you can directly infuse glucose into the bloodstream. So in other words, you're bypassing the gut. And when you infuse it into the bloodstream, your muscle can use that fuel almost at a rate of 2 grams per minute. Now, the traditional problem of ingesting 120 grams per hour is that most sports drinks were formulated with 30 grams in 500 ml. So to ingest 120 grams per hour, you had to consume a lot of fluid. And now what you see is, of course, gels. You see more concentrated drinks. Some drinks like this Science and Sport Beta Fuel range, 80 grams in 500 mils or 40 grams per gel. So now actually it's a lot easier practically to consume that amount of carbohydrate. And as Bob said, if it is practiced and done in the right way, what you tend to see is not very much gastrointestinal complaints. Now, runners is totally different because runners don't practice it as much as the way cyclists do. So you can't apply this to all endurance sports because every endurance sport's different. But I think the evidence base is growing that cyclists at least are more than capable of consuming 120 grams per hour if it's from the right types of products.
Great. Thanks for that, James. I think that's a really important point. It isn't just the research that's moved on, but it is literally the availability of what's in the market. Bob, I suppose bringing that back to you, I mean, how many days in are we now? We're sort of, on the second rest day. How many days have you got to that ceiling where you've had to push up towards 120 grams per hour? Is that a common occurrence for you in this year's tour?
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, what changes the most for us is pre and post meal right meals. So actually during the race, we rarely go below 80 grams an hour. And as soon as the race starts to get harder, towards the end or even from the middle, almost every stage nowadays is at least 120 grams. So sometimes we even push that a bit further, but yeah, like I said, it's cycling has changed a lot, and now every stage is super intense. So just to get those carbohydrates in and to recover well for the next stage, and because I mean even today's stage, if you're fueling too less, you will not feel great, not feel great tomorrow either. So it's just a whole process over 3 weeks.
Yeah, I was just going to say, David, I think that's an excellent point that Bob's made because eating on the bike is the easy part. The hard part is after the stage because practically you're riding through the Alps or Pyrenees or whatever. You may not feel like eating. You're on a bus, it's chaos and chaotic. And what I used to see was that riders hardly ate after a stage. In fact, I used to see some riders who deliberately didn't eat after a stage and waited till they got home for their evening meal. But then you're wasting 3 or 4 hours of recovery. And for sure, I agree completely with Bob there. I think one of the biggest changes has been that attention to detail in the 2, 3, 4 hours after the stage. And that makes a massive difference in how you're going to perform the next day, regardless of what you put on the bike the next day. That period from the finish of stage 5 p.m. to 11 a.m. the next morning is fundamental.
Might just add one thing to that as well, if I can, James, to your point, and Bob, I don't know if you ever saw or experienced this a few years ago when I first started working with the World Tour. Recovery was a protein shake, just whey protein, and that blew my mind, because I was like, "But you've just done 5,000-6,000 kJs on a bike. Like, protein is like, that's part of the recovery process, but so is 1 to 1.5 grams per kilo of carb, especially for the first 3 hours."
I think that's a really important point there, Sam. And Bob, I'd love to know, we've had a question come in. Somebody would love to know, what is the first bottle that's handed to you when you come off the bike? What does that, can you describe that first hour to 90 minutes from a recovery process?
Yeah, I mean, let's take a day like yesterday, for example. So mountaintop finish, really big day. Usually what we do, often we take a bottle of ketones. Then you have cherry juice, which is I think about 20 or 30 grams of carbs and antioxidants, and rehydration, obviously. And then yeah, about 40-50 grams of Haribos, just to get that fast sugar in. And then yeah, again, you ride down on your bike for 15 kilometers, so about, let's say, 20 minutes, with your recovery shake, which is nowadays a mixture of whey protein and carbs as well. You come to the bus, you take a shower, and then yeah, usually what I do, I start with a salty meal. So that could be, like, for example, yesterday was salmon, and pasta, 350 grams of pasta, cooked, and then yeah, maybe a couple of minutes later, a sweet snack, if it's, some kind of cake or fruit, just to get that fructose up a little bit. Or yeah, and then you basically, yeah, you just you try to refill as much as possible within these 2-3 hours. And maybe that example is not the best example, because you have a rest day today, but usually what you do if you have another hard day after that, you just keep on eating more or less until you're in the hotel, and go for massage, maybe have a snack, and then afterwards you go for dinner, and then you go to bed with a full belly.
I mean, it's its own protocol in and of itself, isn't it? I mean, the unglamorous bit there is that 15K bike ride back down the hill.
Exactly.
All of the cameras all of a sudden disappear for, and all of the crowds disappear for. But I mean, it's still a big volume of food. And when you are considering, even post-race, you're still getting, I suppose, liquids and solids in just to start that replenishment process. And as James and Sam have both highlighted, just getting ready for the next day. And I'm going to take this as the final question, because I'm very conscious of time. We have had a question in which is quite pointed towards that sort of that balance between sort of processed carbohydrates and whole food carbohydrates, because there's always an interesting one from a health perspective. There's different ways to look at this, obviously from an energy balance perspective, but maybe James or Sam, I'd love to get your take on the different types of carbohydrate that people are getting in, and also just, as we've seen, the practical application and maybe the need for higher sugar foods.
Well, I think during the race itself, you need things that are fast digesting, can be delivered quickly, and can be used quickly. And processed foods, or I should say specific formulations like glucose, maltodextrin, and fructose, are going to be much easier digested and absorbed than whole foods. And so really, I totally buy into the health versus performance element, but in race, performance is king. Of course, in a training environment, then it's totally different, because you're trying to promote that health and well-being. So the types of carbohydrates that you consume would differ accordingly. I should also say one final point, actually, is I'm sure there'll be a lot of people on here who coach junior athletes. And I don't think we're saying that carbohydrate restriction is advisable for a junior athlete. Absolutely not, because they're still growing. They're still laying down bone tissue. They're still laying down muscle mass. And so the last thing you want to be doing is promoting that message. They will get much more performance benefits just from eating well consistently rather than thinking about any of this stuff. So I just really want to make that message clear that this concept of periodization or restriction, I should say, is more tailored to people who are already at that upper element of their training history. The rest is about fueling for volume.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And I think, like I said, adolescent athletes, let's teach them how to cook. Let's give them those practical skills. Get them in the kitchen and get them to learn how to start to make food. Because when they do start to transition into that next level, God, that's a useful skill. Brilliant. We're a little bit over the hour. Conscious there are a range of questions that we haven't had a chance to answer yet. We'll do our best to answer these on our social channels, and after this session has been recorded. And if you'd like to find out more about James's research, James, where is it best for people to follow or learn more about your and your lab's work?
Probably on Twitter and that, and I can share references to published papers and so on. But look, today's session isn't just about my work. There's lots of independent groups around the world all showing similar things. So the field of sport nutrition is growing rapidly, and there's lots of great research groups out there doing brilliant stuff that's impacting practice.
Brilliant. On that note, I'd like to thank Training Peaks for hosting today's session, Sam as well for his time from our team at Hexus, and we hope to see many more of you in the future. And of course, Bob, best of luck tomorrow. Sorry for disturbing your rest day, and I have no doubt it's going to be a pretty high carbohydrate dinner in advance of tomorrow.
You will. Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.